Okay, looking good, folks. Just go down to our main page and we'll start the and PowerPoints. Today, we'll pretty much begin to close out on the enterprise side of things with a generic enough presentation on industry and competitor analysis. Okay, let's get the show on the road. Too many shy people around here. I know it's probably early in the morning as well. Anyway, right, folks. Industry competitor and analysis. So a little bit more detail on this. So what we'll have a look at again, we'll look at the reason behind it. What are the competitive forces? So generally speaking, what we're looking at is a very well-known model of Porter's five forces, essentially. And we'll start to go down through this, the role of the barriers and identify the non-traditional barriers to entry that especially associated with entrepreneurial firms, any firms. Now, what we can do is substitute entrepreneurial firms with any new product or service that you want to introduce even in an existing company. So how you project manage a new introduction. So think of it from that perspective. So any relation to entrepreneurial stuff, overlay that with new product introduction. So as a project manager, you have to start from the ground up and say, right, what are we going to do? We're introducing a new product. We'll spec it out, find out what the requirements, but you also need to know, are there competitors out there? What's the value of this to the company, and so on? What do we need to watch out for in the external environment? It's not just simply, we'll just focus down and introduce a new product. So you'll have to do some of this prep work as well to see, is it viable? And that's how you build your business case and what the differences are between your new product and something that may already exist on the market. So that's why it actually helps a project manager to get outside the building a little bit more, get outside the immediate project to try and evaluate what potential issues can come down the road. So for example, a barrier to entry might, or not a barrier to entry, but one of the competitive forces might indicate that one of your competitors has a product out there that's similar to the one you're about to develop. Now it becomes your task to find out, well, what can we do differently to make this stand out? And then what are the implications in terms of the project, its technology, and so on. So we look at it from that perspective. So it's not just like pure business model as such or business concept. It has a very real impact and value to a project manager in terms of being in touch or aware of all the things that are happening outside the project as well, obviously, as inside the project. So we look at the 4 related questions to ask before pursuing an idea for a firm. Okay. Look at the 5 primary industry types and opportunities that they offer. Explain the purpose of a competitor analysis, which I kind of briefly just mentioned there. Look at the 3 groups of competitors as that the new firm might face as such, and describe the way the firm can ethically obtain information about its competitors. Oh, that's a difficult one now. Ethically. Stealing plans, setting in spies. I'm not joking. That does go on in companies. It could be a chat down in the local pub with your counterpart. I know I did that when I was working with Meteor. One of my counterpart in O2 at the time was a guy by the name of Campbell Scott, and we used meat. We used meat for coffee, lunch, and whatever, and say, well, what are you doing in your projects? And he said, well, I don't know, Mark, I can tell you, can you keep this? Yeah, I said, I won't say anything for the time being. We won't act on it. And this is what we were doing. I said, oh, interesting. We were thinking of doing something like that. Let us know how you're getting on. So we swap ideas around, and we might even plan, well, he might say that, well, we're going to introduce this next month. If you're coming in pretty quickly after us, delay for a month, give us a bit more time to get some traction on it, it'll benefit you, and so on. So we swap ideas around like that. Was it unethical? No, because there was a mutual benefit to it, and we built up a good trust between myself and my competitor as such. So it wasn't a all-out war by any stretch of the imagination. It was very flexible. Now, it wasn't happening every week. This could be every couple of months or so, just touching base and to see how we could influence each other and benefit from each other in terms of and optimize our technologies as we're moving forward. So that's how we gathered information, I will say ethically or otherwise. And then we'll finally, describe the reasons for completing a competitive analysis grid. So we have a tool that we can use to start identifying the impacts that could potentially happen on our project. So what is the analysis? So a group of firms producing similar products or services such as airlines, fitness drinks, furniture, electronic games, all in the same, they're in industries. Okay, so and the industry analysis is a business research that focuses on the potential of an industry. So let us take, if we're in the electronic games industry, then we look at the attractiveness of this or not. So we carry out a research. Is it a growing market? It is. What are the elements of the growing market? What are people looking for? And then we'll find out maybe in the electronics games that the big move is towards more virtual reality, more of a tactile feel, so that you can experience a bit more when you're in the game, whether it's a vibrating seat or your games controller is vibrating to give you tactile feedback. So we might look at these aspects of the industry and say, okay, there's an opportunity here that we could possibly develop our product or introduce a new product or a new feature to a product that gives a different sensation to the game user, for example. So we'll have to look at it and say, well, what are the others? Are there other companies in the electronic game industry? Are they doing something similar? And then we'll see, how have these sensory features, how have they been accepted by gamers in previous editions? And we could analyze of that. So you see where we're looking, we're getting a feel for what's out there and so on, and we're trying to find a particular, should we say, a needle in the haystack or a USP according to your business model canvas. We're looking for something unique that we can find and drive in terms of a new product introduction or a new feature introduction into the games industry. There is one real big challenge. Say if you take the cycling industry, and if you look at particular what trends are happening, people love data. Cyclists love to get data. Serious cyclists do anyway. And how do we gather data? Well, we have speedometers, we've computerized head units, we have chest monitors and so on. But also, quite importantly, we have power meters. Now, there are several types of power meters. Are they on the actual pedals, the cranks, the arms? Are they built into the pedals themselves, the cleats? The actual pedals can be power meters, or they can be power meters in the hubs of the wheels. The latest thing I've been looking at is and that's a growing industry. So we can get data and see how much we're improving our fitness and balance and all this sort of stuff. So the latest one is, can we build power meters into the cleats, the clip-on elements that go onto the end of a cycling shoe that enable you to clip into the pedal and stay firm in that. So that piece here, can that be that little, it's an interchangeable piece. Every time you buy a new pair of shoes or every time you wear down these cleats, you have to obviously put in new ones. But it would mean that if you have a power meter in the cleat, every time you change your shoes, you can have the same power meters, and it doesn't matter what bike. So it becomes independent of the bike and becomes more usable and more user-friendly. They haven't cracked it yet. There's been some attempts at it, so newer companies are coming out with possibilities in the foreseeable future. Some patents are coming out. So that's the kind of, the potential. So there is an actual an existing billion-dollar company looking at this technology because they have so many other pieces of equipment in that industry. But now they're seeing this as an opportunity, as does, I mean, if they crack it, if they can come up with a solution, they're going to make an absolute fortune on this. But other companies will try and follow on. So you have a whole range of companies supplying the different meters today, even whether they're crank-based, whether they're so on and so forth. So it's, again, the potential. So we look at this and you can see and you say, well, what's influencing the cycling industry? The pandemic. This coronavirus has caused a lot of lockdown, but the sales of bikes has gone through the roof. It's gone crazy. It's impossible. I was down in a bike shop last Tuesday morning, thinking of buying another new bike. There's a saying about among cyclists: how many bikes do you have? One plus N, or N plus one, whatever number of bikes you keep adding to it. Anyway, the point about it is we can't get bikes until 2022. Supply chain. And where did they come from? China and Taiwan. It's next to impossible to get bikes. The supply chain just can't handle it at the moment, and the demand has been increasing. And mostly, interesting enough, in the mountain biking has popularity has increased. So there are opportunities in there tremendously. So you see what I'm saying? The industry, what's happening? What are the influences? And even though the supply is difficult at the moment, we're not getting the supplies into Europe. The existing supplies that are getting through, the prices have gone up. A lot of the main manufacturers have increased price by 15-20% on their bikes. And interestingly, when we analyze it further, we see that investment funds are buying into companies, are buying biking companies, because they see the potential of this taking off, which it is. It's becoming more and more popular, and so on, so on, so on. So you can see how all this external analysis, so if you're an engineer or a company providing equipment into the biking industry today, and you look at some new piece of technology that you could introduce, you'll have done all of this analysis, and you will find that there's tremendous opportunity, because the market is going up and up and up, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So basically what I've just described is essentially the whole process of these charts, of this process. So we do an industry analysis. Once it's determined if we're going into a new product, or we'll look at the industry itself, and then the analysis helps the firm to determine if the target market is identified during feasibility analysis is favorable to a new firm. So as I've just described using the biking industry, we would say yes, it is favorable to a new firm. You could have a startup tomorrow morning, let's just say introducing some new type of handlebars, for example, or you have a new electric engine. E-bikes are becoming extremely popular, and the whole trick in e-bikes is getting the power into bikes while keeping the weight down. So newer models are coming out all the time. So the industry is becoming extremely attractive. Now, why is that attractive? Because if you look at the age profile of people that are using bikes, and particularly e-bikes, you'll find that they're either commuters going to and from work, or older people who like that little bit of extra assistance so they can go out and enjoy cycling, which is far more beneficial than just walking or jogging, certainly on your joints and your knees and your hips and all that. So that's exactly the kind of industry analysis. We start to fine-tune it down to the market level and see what the potential for growth is. Now, in our business cases, then we feed all this data in. So we look at trends and so on. So these are all the scenarios that we feed in to see, does this make it worthwhile? So let's keep going. So we've identified an industry. So these are the basic type of questions. Is the industry accessible? In other words, is it realistic to place? Is it realistic place for a new venture to enter? Does it make it worthwhile? Can you get in there? Are there many competitors in there already? There may be. Should that stop you? Not necessarily. Not until you find out if there's something unique that, when you look at all the existing competitors and what they're offering, you might say, well, we can do something slightly different, and the market is growing, so we could attract numbers of people to buy our new technology. So does the industry contain markets that are ripe for innovation or are underserved? Okay, and that's my point. Is it, can we introduce something new? Can we look at, and now if I'm going to keep talking about the bike industry because I know a bit more about it. And today you have what's known as the governing body, the UCI. It's a French name, Union Cycliste Internationale, but it governs globally the cycling and the professional cycling market and so on. And all members of cycling clubs in Ireland, for example, and any other country would be members of the UCI. So where I'm coming to here is that we can see that the market is growing, and that UCI have constraints on the structure and form of bikes. And one of the important constraints is that the bike has to be no lighter than 6.81 kilograms. That's their reckoning. So every bike in competition has to be at least 6.81 kilograms in weight. Bikes can be produced as little as 3 kilograms. 2.5 I've seen in one case, but they're illegal according to the UCI rules. Now questions are beginning to be asked. Do we need to comply to the UCI regulation of 6.81 kilograms if we're not in competition? And is it time to change because the technology has moved on, that carbon bikes, for example, can be produced at a much lower weight. So the lighter the bike is, the more efficient the cyclist can be. And particularly if you're an older person, you don't have to push as much weight, including your own body weight plus the weight of the bike. You reduce that, it makes it more efficient and more enjoyable. So these are the kind of things when we look at the innovations that we can introduce, and eventually we can force or influence change in the industry itself. Okay, and then are there positions in the industry that avoid some of the negative attributes of the industry as a whole? So what can we look at? And that would have been one of the examples of the negative attributes, the weight limitation. So is that a possibility? So companies, you can be quite sure that companies are already producing much lighter frames and bikes. And in competition today, some of the cyclists have to put lead weights into their bikes to bring them up to the standard weight. So the market is there. The constraints, even though they exist, perhaps will change. So now we need to look at the different levels. The firm levels include a firm's assets, products, culture, teams, teamwork among its employees, reputation, and other resources. So this is what we look at. Have we got the skill sets? Have we got the brain power? Have we got the assets, the capabilities, the equipment, and so on to compete? And then we look at the industry level, include the new threat of new entrants, rivalry among existing, bargaining power of buyers, and related factors. So at the industry level, so we find that yes, we have a good company, or we're a new startup, or we're an existing company, but we have skills that we can develop new technology, and we now need to see, can we go into the market with this? Can we introduce some new feature? Is it ready? Is the market ready for these new innovative projects, new product introduction, for example? And then the conclusion is, in various studies, researchers have found that from 8 to 30% of the variation in firms' profitability is directly attributable to the industry in which a firm competes. So translated, it means that when you introduce stuff, because companies know their competitive environment more effectively, because they have deep insights into it, then they know how to improve what they're doing, what they're delivering, to make it more profitable amongst all the existing products or similar type products, for example. So assessing the industry attractiveness, we look at the environmental and business trends, and then we take the 5 competitive forces. So if you think of the example that I've been talking about, the whole cycling industry and where it's been going in the last number of years and what has influenced as such. And then we start to say, well, that's an interesting industry, bicycles. What can be interesting about it then is, do we look at competitive bikes or do we look at leisure bikes. So we start to break down, and then we start to look, we apply these 5 competitive forces model and to try and develop something. So environmental trends, include economic trends, social trends, technological advances, and political and regulatory changes. For example, industries that sell products to seniors, old folks like me, are benefiting by the aging of the population. And that's a very true point. And I think I might have mentioned this to you before. If you're thinking of getting into an industry or into a business that you would see as profitable, definitely in the aged health and fitness, that is a phenomenally growing industry. Whatever it is, whether it is sports equipment, whether it is exercising regimes or bicycles, whatever it takes, people are living longer, and they have more disposable incomes. Pension age is rising, which means that people are generally speaking fitter and more able to stay on at work, which means that there's a whole possibility of improving health, so people who want to stay on working can do so. But if they don't, there's a whole day to be filled in terms of activities and so on. So these can be any sort of activities. So seniors, for example, is one business. So business trends, other trends that impact an industry. So for example, are profit margin in the industry increasing or falling? Is innovation accelerating or waning? And are input costs going up or down? So these are all the elements we need to evaluate in terms of the business. So if you look at any of these, for example, are the profit margins in the industry increasing or falling? Well, profit margins are increasing, certainly in the biking world. As I just mentioned, anywhere between 12 and 20% increase in the retail price of bikes. If you look at, bike pricing, anywhere from, you can buy something for a few €100, but generally speaking, people are looking at, €1,500, €2,000, 4,000, 5,000, 9,000, 10,000, and one bike I saw last night, €17,000. I said, mother of God, who would spend €17,000 on a bike? The average, the high end bikes would be 12, 13,000 euros. And I said, that's ridiculous price. They are selling. There's a one brand which is Specialized, quite well known, American company. They have all their products made in China and they're shipped globally. And their top end, their mountain bikes, 10, 12, 14,000 for the top end. Same for the race bikes. And they have a new lightweight bike, which is below the UCI standard, and it's selling for 14,000, 15,000 euros. People are buying them. They're selling them. They're impossible to get at the moment, supplied partially. But do you think it's costing that to make them? Absolutely not. You're talking in the lower hundreds of euros to have these bikes made. They're mass produced. There are phenomenal factories in China and Taiwan that are making all these products. Oftentimes the products are made in the same factory for different companies are making the products, bikes, in the same huge factories. That's fine. It's in marketing after that, and after that the costs begin to add on to it. But there is serious profitability in these. Anywhere between 40 and 70% profit margins. That's attractive. Okay. So an explanation of the 5 forces models. We'll look at the 5 competitive forces model in a framework, and we'll look at that now in a minute. And the model is composed of the forces that determine industry profitability, and they help determine the average rate of return for the firms within an industry itself. So if you invest in this. So an explanation of the 5 forces continued. Each of the 5 forces impacts the average rate of return for the firms in the industry by applying pressure on the industry profitability. Now that's the important point. I'll come on and explain that now shortly. But that's what we need to be watching. We can't just focus on one of the forces. We have to look at all of them, because if we're not aware, something can happen and catch us blindsided, so to speak. So well-managed firms try to position a firm in a way that avoids or diminishes these forces in an attempt to beat the average rate of return of the industry. So they try and look at some way. So for example, they could be doing deals with suppliers, spreading their suppliers around such that they're not under obligation to one supplier, otherwise they could be held to ransom, say, for argument's sake. In other words, we're increasing our manufacturing costs, therefore you're going to have to pay us more, and that reduces the profitability. So here's the model itself. Threat of substitutes, other products that can replace yours. New entrants, also new companies coming in with newer technologies to challenge yours. Rivalry amongst existing firms. So you've whatever one company does, the existing one say, we better do that or do it better. That kind of rivalry will begin. And of course the other two big ones, the power of the buyers and the power of the suppliers. And so if you have only one supplier, they have a monopoly. That's a huge threat to your business and to the industry. If there's only one supplier, if there was only one supplier of vaccine, they could hold the whole world to ransom for COVID-19 vaccine. They don't, fortunately. That's why so many. Is this attractive? Yes, because they're making money. Why do you think all these big companies are creating vaccines for the good of humanity? Nope, there's money in it. Absolute money, and that's why they're all racing and racing. It never has been the competition so high. In other words, the rivalry amongst existing firms in producing vaccines and different types. And you could see, for example, AstraZeneca needs to be cold stored. Now the new one today that should be approved apparently this week or today, the Johnson & Johnson, has more effectiveness against all the strains of known strains or variants of the virus, and only needs one injection and can be stored at room temperature. So a USP, don't need cold storage, and so on. So this is the rivalry amongst the firms and the bargaining power of suppliers. So as more and more vaccines become approved, then the price goes down because countries will start to shop around. Okay, and this will be an ongoing thing. This is the new flu, as I call it. So next year you'll be getting your COVID vaccination booster. You won't be getting any flu. Flu has been virtually non-existent this year. Been no deaths from flu, apparently. And then the bargaining power of buyers. Again, that can take funny effects. For example, if people believe that, and social media would be the big influencer. If let's just say a rumor went out on social media that the new Johnson & Johnson vaccine has serious side effects of you'll grow an extra ear, or you end up with, I don't know, some kind of affliction. Let's just say it like that. And that goes out on social media. That's the power of the buyer. They can say, oh, Jesus, we're not going to buy that, for example. Or if all the buyers came together for, as in the case of the EU, the bargaining power of one big block of countries is far more effective than so once all the countries agreed under the EU to do deals with the vaccine companies, then they have power. They have bargaining power because they're 300 or 400 million citizens, so to speak. That's giving you bargaining power. If all countries had gone independently, which the vaccine companies would love to have, it would have meant that there would have been unfair. Only the most powerful and the strongest and most wealthiest countries would get better deals because they could afford to buy it, and smaller countries, including Ireland, would be left on the brink with no vaccines and so on. So that's how we get the power of buyers influencing the industry. So threat of substitutes, prices that the price that consumers are willing to pay for a product depends on, in part, on the availability of substitute products. So again, if you we'll stick with the vaccine example, as more and more substitutes or alternatives come online, then prices go down because the companies say, well, we can't monopolize this anymore. I did choose the vaccine by way of example because it has a rather unique attribute normally. Usually when pharmaceutical products are introduced, there is a patent taken out on each product or each pharmaceutical, and usually that lasts for 7 years. So from the time of development to the time for 7 years, if they get the product out, it's reasonably quickly. Let's just say they file the patent today, and in 2 years' time they have the product approved and ready to sell to the general public. That means they have 5 years protected. No one can copy that pharmaceutical product. That's the normal case. Why? Because they usually invest hundreds of millions. On average today, the figure is something like 21 billion, 20 to 21 billion dollars to develop a new high-end drug as such. And that's why they're protected. No one else can copy that drug, use that drug, only that one manufacturer, to recover their costs. And on the last day of the 7th year, when the patent expires, all hell breaks loose. Everyone can go in, look at the patent and say, oh, we can do this, they're already doing it. They would have already said, right, we know how we can reverse engineer this, and we can now have something ready in 7 years' time. That's the normal process within the pharmaceutical industry. But as you're saying, this has been a different case here. We haven't waited 7 years. We were already looking. Now, to say that this was all new, of course not, because pharmaceutical companies would have already been looking at all these different viruses and coming up with solutions anyway. And some of them were just more affected, or some of these solutions are new drugs that we're getting now, vaccines, are built on existing technologies. Why? Because they've used it for other types of vaccines. I mean, there are thousands of viruses out there. It's just some are more prolific than others, but generically, and they're constantly coming out with viruses and cures for them. So it's a constant battle. That's why they spend so much money on them, and so on. And it even mentions it down here. For example, there are few, if any, substitutes for prescription medicines, which is one of the reasons pharmaceutical industry is so profitable. That's the reason why they're protected, and they make what's known as supernormal profits up to the 7th year. Now, there's an interesting twist in that. Because at the end of the 7 years, you will normally have the competitors releasing products, and they'll have refined and improved the production processes, so they'll introduce it at a slightly lower price to get a slice of the market. And the behavior of the consumer is, the buyer is that, oh, we'll stick with the brand that we know, the first one that came out. But eventually the substitutes begin to take over because they find that they're doing the same job, or maybe doing a better job than the original brand. But the original brand doesn't stop at, they're already competing against themselves. They'll introduce a cheaper version of their own product, or it could exactly be the same product because they're making supernormal profits. They repackage it, rebrand it into something else. So now they have two products going out to try and hold on to as much of the market or the total revenues as possible. Do you understand that point? It's an interesting concept. So, in contrast, when close substitutes for a product exist, industry profitability is suppressed because consumers will opt out if the price gets too high. So when you have choice, when the consumer, the buyer, has choice, profitability goes down, and that's the whole idea of it. And as you said, and because a company has a unique brand, a new pharmaceutical company has a very powerful drug. The competitors will see that that's extremely attractive. They're making supernormal profits. We better get into that market as soon as possible. Okay, so the threat of substitutes, the extent to which suppresses the profitability within the industry, and that drives buyers to choose alternatives as it happens. So this is why firms in an industry often offer their customers amenities to reduce the likelihood that they will switch to a substitute product, even in light of a price increase. Okay, so that's the point I was making, that sometimes companies come out with the lower end. That's why if you take any other industry, say for instance car industry, bike industry, particularly take the car industry, you have a whole range of cars. If you were interested in buying Mercedes, You can buy the top of the range SL AMG 2-door if you want to spend a couple of €100,000, or you can buy a C-Class for €35,000, brand new. In any case, they have products at different price points: entry level, executive level, luxury level, and sports level, for example. So they cater for all the different markets, and they constantly refine those. So do BMW, so do Toyota, and so on and so on. Toyota mightn't have the high-end expensive cars. They do have a couple of them now. GTR, for example, sports car, or the Lexus, which is a Toyota brand. So they have products that can compete at those different levels and price points. Why? Because the industry is attractive. So the industry, if we look at the threat of substitutes again, finally, the this independability owned coffee shop doesn't just sell coffee. So what do we add on? So in other words, it offers patrons convenient place to meet, socialize, and all that, and it provides these amenities to decrease the likelihood that its customers will substitute coffee at this shop for a less expensive alternative somewhere else. So it becomes about the experience. So it's not just about the product, but the associated experience around. That's why restaurants theme themselves. You know, what's attractive. You know, it's a Mexican type restaurant. It's a Chinese type restaurant. It's a Japanese type restaurant. It's a Hungarian type restaurant. They'll put the different atmospheres together to hold on to their customers, create uniqueness. So new entrance threat, we'll just briefly, so unless something is done to stop this, the competition in the industry will increase and the average industry profitability will decline. So what do we do here, the threat of new entrants? We constantly try to refine our products. We might reduce our selling price. We might introduce new technologies for production, improve processes to make it unattractive to new entrants. Or we could say that the new production processes are extremely costly. It's not easy to get into the car industry because you would need several $billion just to set up a production plant to be able to produce cars, generally speaking. Or you could come in and try and make once-off customized cars and so on. Depends. But new entrants onto the mass market would be virtually unheard of. Virtually, although there is one new company that's challenging, oh God, I can't think of the name of it, electric cars and so on. But it's been seen as a hugely attractive market, so they raise the capital to develop their products and so on, so on, so on. But generally speaking, we try to do that. So firms in an industry try to keep the number of new entrants as low as by erecting barriers. So a barrier to entry conditions creates the disincentive for the new firm. So try to stop them coming in. So what are the kind of barriers? The economies of scale, which I just mentioned there, large industries with huge capital investment and so on, the economies of scale. Product differentiation, such that, you know, for a soft drinks industry that are characterized by the firms with strong brands and are difficult to break into without spending heavily on advertising. So for example, if you want to challenge Coca-Cola and Coke itself, what was it, Dr. Pepper was the closest thing I think that might have come to Coke, and so on. So it's extremely difficult, but the branding of these companies is phenomenal. So you just trying to convince people that your version of cola is better than Coke's cola or Dr. Pepper's cola would absolutely cost a fortune. It would all come down to branding. It might taste like rubbish. Anyway, and then the capital requirements, which I said, the amount of investment to develop a new firm and build your assets, buy your assets, build them, and so on, to be before you even start to sell the products, can be phenomenally large. The cost advantage independent of size. So existing firms may have cost advantage not related to size. For example, the existing firm in an industry may have purchased land when it was less expensive than it is today. Yeah, it's a moot point really, but very, very weak point in terms of a barrier to entry. If you found that land in a particular location was extremely expensive, then you just change location, relocate, and look at the alternatives, look at the trade-offs for buying cheaper land elsewhere to build your premises or build your production plants and so on. even going abroad might be far more effective. Hence, we have the outsourcing, offshoring. Government and legal barriers. Some industries, such as broadcasting, require a granting of a license by the public authority to compete. Well, obviously the case, if you want to set up your TV, radio station, you need to have a license. And that's a way of governing. And in some countries, for instance, in Germany, if you want to open up your local barber shop, you have to get permission and a license to do that. Why? They'll evaluate the number of customers in that particular location, and they say, well, we already have 2 barber shops, a third one would be uneconomical for the existing 2. Or whether it is a hairdresser's or a bar or a restaurant, all of these, or an exercise gym, whatever. The local municipalities will evaluate the viability and give you a license to operate or not, which makes good sense. So everyone wins. That doesn't mean that they have monopolies inside there. No way. They'll look at what serves the broader community. That can be the kind of legal or government legal barriers, because oftentimes you see in other countries, one restaurant opens up and then another one might open up next door to it. They might be very different, but that would be evaluated by the government themselves. How are we doing time-wise? Need to move along. So national barriers to entry are non-traditional, difficult for startups to execute barriers to entry that are expensive, such as economies of scale, because money is usually tight, of course. So startups have to rely on non-traditional barriers to entry to discourage new entrants, such as assembling a world-class management team. That would be difficult for another company to replicate, or getting really top-class experts in technical experts working in the company that can't be copied. So knowledge is difficult to copy. Expertise is difficult to copy, and that can protect them. So the way in which you develop new products, you even down to your project methodology, is more efficient than something else. To be able to turn around new products and features can be a huge competitive advantage and stop people. So not just what you do, but the way you do it. Non-traditional barriers, the strength of the management team, first mover advantage, the fact that you get out there more quickly than competitors, and then the passion of the management team and the employees. Highly motivated organizations having unique sets of skills, the team that works exceptionally well together, having the processes, the methodologies in place that enable the team to get the jobs done more efficiently, produce projects, introduce new products, and so on and so on. All these can be an extremely powerful barrier to entry, because we can't copy that team, they're too good. It's like having I don't know, Manchester United, top class players. Very hard to copy that team. Why? They have a lot of money, but at the same time they have high sets of skills. So if you were a 4th division team, you wouldn't have the same skill sets, essentially. Other non-traditional, unique business model, which is really important. How are you going to get to the customers? What way are you going to develop your customer channels? The way you develop your operations, your supply chain management, your in-house processes, and so on and so forth might be unique. These are constantly developing. You might have a simplified model that takes a lot of the overhead costs out of it. You might have just pure core competencies and everything else is outsourced, but they're outsourced and you have some deferred payment, which means you get better credit terms, and therefore you can use your money far more wisely because of your business model. Internet domain name. Okay, that can give you a good name is worth its weight in gold. And to be able to for consumers to remember, and to be able to brand, so to speak. Well, not so to speak, in actual fact, having good brand name. So inventing a new approach to an industry. So if a startup invents a new approach to an industry and executes it in an exemplary fashion, these factors create a barrier to entry. So it's the way you do business. So for example, Dell changed the industry, computer retail industry, by selling directly to customers online, creating their own channel directly, and removing the physical shops and so on and so forth to sell their products. Others looked at this and said, we better move as well, or we're going to be left behind. So yeah, you have several possibilities. And then the rivalry amongst existing firms. Third point, how we done time wise? We're going to have to start wrapping on these ones because I'll not get to finish it. We're only halfway through. Oops. So in most industries, the majority or the major dominant determinant of industry profitability is the level of competition amongst existing firms. So some industries are fiercely competitive, and in other industries, competition is much less intense and price competition is subdued. So again, how many players are in the market as it is? And you do have your industry life cycle as well as you have your product life cycle. Again, an S-curve, but first to introduce a new product, then everyone starts to jump in because it's attractive, and then it's only the survival of the fittest that reaches to the mature stage of the industry. Similar to the product life cycle, you have the industry life cycle. So when you have a number of big players competing vigorously in the mature state, and oftentimes it can be the case that the first into the industry can be dropped very, very quickly. Competitors can take over and growth can go and new entrants come up. So the industry, those that started the industry years ago are gone. Take Kodak, for instance, the cameras and films and so on and so forth. They were the household name. Nokia were a household name and the biggest share of the market. Where are they today? They're certainly not to be seen in the phone business. Sony Ericsson doesn't exist in terms of their phones anymore. It's all Samsung, iPhones, Huawei's. So it rotates. 20 years ago, it was Motorola, Ericsson, maybe Alcatel, a few of them there. But all those players are virtually non-existent. The industries move on. And that's what we're talking about here, the competition inside there. So the number and balance of the competitors, the degree of difference between the products. That's in the phone industry, the degree of difference that you had two big differences. You have either iPhone or Android or Apple OS, Apple iOS, and they're the two big differentiators. That's all that exists today in terms of the technologies. They've moved from basic handsets to making and receiving phone calls to entertainment and health devices. So the industry has moved on dramatically over the last number of years, and it's still moving that direction. Still moving towards, focusing a little bit more on health as a device and measurement device and so on, your mobile phone, and still with social media and other platforms on and so on. So it has. Is there much difference? No. The platforms, once they're able to host the platforms, there's virtually no difference between the phones then. So the great growth rate, so the competition among the firms in a slow growth industry is stronger than among those in the fast growth industry. And that's what I'm talking about when we mentioned the industry life cycle. So the rate at which it grows. When mobile phone, what's the one I'm thinking of now? There. Well, we'll stick with the mobile phone industry. So that was slow in the early stages, but then as more and more competitors came in and licenses, when there was deregulation of the mobile systems and the operators, it opened up a whole new potential for new entrants, which they did, and that required new equipment. And now as technology moved on, it's growing at a phenomenal rate. We're already into 5G and it's growing bigger. And then add in an issue like pandemics, and it causes the industry to change slight direction into home working and so on, and availability of broadband. So this is going to further increase the rollout of faster networks and therefore newer devices, and eventually we'll be able to have much more powerful virtual reality systems on our mobile phones. The level of fixed costs, of course, I've covered that already. So the break even. So if you have to invest heavily in to enter a particular industry, how quickly can you get that money back? So your return on investment becomes a big issue. Again, sticking with that example of the mobile phones, the costs of the licenses were phenomenally high. Companies were partnering with each other to try and buy a license in each country, and then they decide to deregulate, and a number of years later to make it more competitive, and yeah, a lot of companies would have lost a lot of money by virtue, so they never got a return on those huge licenses that they paid to national governments, and so essentially that became didn't get the returns. Now, folks, that is point 3 of the rivalry, and the next area we're going to. I will not continue on this now because we've only got a. No, yes, I'll keep going this one. I'll briefly fly through this one, so we'll get the job done. Power suppliers can suppress the profitability of the industries into which they sell, by raising prices or reducing the quality of the components. So that's literally, are you buying from one supplier or multiple suppliers? So if you have the fewer of suppliers of components, so if you take, for example, in the computer industry, electronics industry, and you only had Intel, well, they could increase their prices because they'd have a monopoly. Stands to reason. But of course, you don't only have Intel. You have AMD and other chip manufacturers. And then because of the demands of different parts of the electronic industry, are they making chips for mobile phones? Are they making chips for laptops? Are they making chips for enterprise level computers and so on, and all the technology? So it becomes attractive, but there are more and more entrants. But if there were any, that's pure and simply the whole premise of power of suppliers. And if, say for instance, only Intel existed, let's just hypothetically think of that, and I'm sitting back here and I say, well, that supplier, they have a monopoly, I'm going to get into that, and we can really see the attractiveness of getting there. Huge capital investment. They're building extensions literally 5 kilometers away from me here, and they're several $billion for each fabrication unit. Why? Because they see huge growth in chip manufacture. Why? Because so many other devices. Why? Because technology is changing. What's the technology? 5G. Therefore, we can put a chip into almost anything and transmit and receive data. So it's still an extremely attractive industry. I mean, 5G is only the start of it. It'll go on. They're already looking at 6G. So that's the whole premise, or the whole point about the suppliers. So when the fewer there are, the higher the cost of raw materials. That has to be passed on to the consumer. So supplier concentration, where they are, and if there are only a few suppliers to supply critical products to a large number of buyers, the supplier has an advantage. Okay, depending on what the products are. Certain pharmaceuticals can only be sourced in certain parts of the world, so those suppliers won't say have a monopoly, but they have a strong hold unless they find alternative ingredients to deliver the same medicinal effect without those original suppliers. Then these guys can charge. And then we have what's known as switching cost. The fixed cost that buyers encounter when switching or changing from one supplier to another. So if the switching costs are high, a buyer will be less likely to switch suppliers. Now, in the financial industry, this used to be a big issue. For instance, if you had a mortgage on a house, you wanted to go to a different mortgage lender because they had lower interest rates. It was cost prohibitive. In other words, the cost of paying solicitors' fees and all this stuff, and clearing out your loan and taking out the new mortgage, these costs were quite high. So you wouldn't do it. It wouldn't have been worth it. The cost benefit, it would have taken too many years before you saw the benefit of the interest. And of course, then the interest rates could have changed. So it wasn't worth it. So to make that easier, they removed legislation plus competition in the market have removed and dramatically reduced switching costs. So now, whether it is a mortgage, whether it is your electricity supplier, your gas supplier, all of these switching costs have become literally, a guy can walk up to my door and say, what are you spending on your gas and electricity? We'll bundle a package. Show me your last couple of meter readings. Yeah, we can do this a little bit lower. And on their tablet type equipment, I can sign it and dotted line, done and dusted, switching, done. And I'm getting my utility costs at a lower price. It's that switching enablement that's made the market highly competitive, good for consumers. So it removed one of these bargaining powers of the supplier tremendously. Legislation was primarily the driver of that. So attractiveness of substitutes. So supplier power is enhanced if there are no attractive substitutes. I've just demonstrated that there are many attractive substitutes. So you have so many people, so many service providers offering alternatives, which we can consider to be substitutes. So the threat of forward integration, so the power of the supplier is enhanced if there is a credible possibility that the supplier might enter the buyer's industry. Okay, so that's where the supplier could say that, okay, I'm supplying these components to this manufacturer, they're selling them on and they're making a profit larger than me, so I'll buy the manufacturing company. I'm the supplier, now I buy it, so I begin to take more control of not just the raw components but also the manufacturing process. So I'm getting higher profits, and that's one threat of forward integration. And particularly if they have such a high price that they can force the supplier or the manufacturing company to sell their company to them, to the supplier, that kind of thing. Does it go on? Absolutely. Now, folks, I'm a little over halfway in these. I will not roll it over onto Tuesday. I want to stick to my original plan with the earned value and our discussions and things like that. Okay, folks, we're back here again to do the final part of the industry and competitor analysis. Okay, and bring out our PowerPoint. Now, as I said, the final part of the analysis model is, of course, the bargaining power of the buyers. So we can say that, for example, they can suppress the profitability of various industries from which they purchase by demanding price concessions or increases in quality. So again, that's the most fundamental type of pressure you have from buyers. Now, bearing in mind that this can happen even in mature industries, and by that I mean where there are many suppliers such as yourselves or the companies you work for. You are the actual company selling to the end consumer, and the pressure they can bring on you is that they won't buy a product if they find something cheaper or better quality elsewhere. So, for example, the automobile industry is dominated by a handful of large companies that buy products from thousands of suppliers in different industries. This allows the automakers to suppress the profitability of industries from which they buy by demanding price reductions. So this is the flip side of it. You, as the manufacturer, before you sell on to your buyers, you are actually a buyer yourself from other industries. And again, if you're buying in bulk orders, for example, you can negotiate better terms, better credit terms, better prices, and insist on better quality, putting in service level agreements and so on to comply with maybe your agile production or lean production manufacturing processes. So you can put considerable pressure on your suppliers, because usually these are smaller entities, as I say, thousands of them. And if you look at any car manufacturer, they will have thousands of suppliers, and they will have options and backups in case one supplier might run into some kind of difficulty. They'll have an alternative supplier to and they usually offer out tenders to suppliers looking for the best of prices. Walmart would be another example of a large company that has multiple suppliers, and therefore they do exert a lot of pressure on their suppliers. So Walmart, operating as a buyer, for example, can put a lot of pressure on their suppliers to drive down costs, drive down prices, to make Walmart more competitive amongst the other players such as Target and so on. So moving on, we then look at the bargaining powers of the buyers, as we say, buyer group concentration, and then buyer costs. So if there are a few large buyers, then they buy from a large number of suppliers. They can put pressure on, as I just explained. And then again, the greater the importance of an item is to a buyer, the more sensitive the buyer will be to the price it pays. So the buyer's costs. And so the greater the importance of an item is to a buyer, the more sensitive the buyer will be to the price it pays. So again, if it's a critical part, for example, they will be very conscious of what they're paying for, meaning that they might be willing to go that little bit higher because it's an integral part of their product as such. So they might be willing to pay that little bit extra to the suppliers themselves. But where there are, and maybe where there are multiple buyers from that same supplier, there could be a competition there on the price itself and the quantities demanded and supplied. I mean, if you just take, for example, issues today on vaccine, for example, there are so many buyers in the market. They're buying in block. We say we have China, Russia, Europe, and the United States. They would be buying in large quantities. Therefore, they're negotiating better deals with the suppliers. However, the suppliers are finding it difficult to meet production levels. But into that, you can see that there are a number of other vaccines being approved. Therefore, competition is increasing almost by the week between the actual suppliers, whether it is AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, Pfizer, and so on. There will be more, of course, coming out. And again, each will have different selling propositions. But if those that are that can comply to deliveries will, of course, get better attention from the buyers themselves. So again, the bargaining powers of it, the degree of standardization of suppliers' products, so the degree to which a supplier's products differ from competitors affects the buyer's bargaining power. So if there are customized versions of products that each buyer wants from the various suppliers, then that weakens their position. But the more standardized, if it's pretty much off the shelf, so when the supplier, in this case up here, this person, the supplier, when they're producing standardized products, then it makes life a lot easier for the competitors to pay pretty much the same price. So they'll have to find other areas to cut back on costs. So the threat of backward integration, so the power of buyers is enhanced if there is a credible threat that the buyer might enter the supplier's industry. So to guarantee your supplies, you might buy your supplier, and that's what they refer to here as the power of the buyer is enhanced if there's a credible threat. So if they believe that there is more competition coming into the market, they might actually backwards integrate by the supplier such that they can guarantee the supply into their own manufacturing plants and keep the continuity and so on. While at the same time they can still be selling any surplus that they wouldn't be using, could be selling it to the competitors at a higher price. Pretty much standard practice. So let's have a look at an application of these 5 forces in play. So the first application of the model, so the 5 forces model can be used to assess the attractiveness of an industry by determining the level of threat to industry profitability for each of the forces. So we go around the clock and we look at all of these forces. So if a firm fills out the form shown in the next slide, and then several of the threats to the industry profitability are high, the firm may want to reconsider entering the industry or think carefully about its position that it might occupy in there. So here's, for example, a simple layout, and it kind of introduces the risk element, so the low, medium, and high profitability, and that similarly could be the risk elements being the corollary of that. particular side. So threat of substitute. So you go through each of the 5, and then step 1, select an industry, determine the level of the threat to industry profitability, use the table to get an overall feel for the attractiveness, and then use the table to identify the threats that are most often relevant to the industry profitability. So, which, for example, it might be the threat of, or the bargaining power of suppliers. That might be considered, because if there are too few suppliers, that could be considered to be an ongoing threat. So we'd have to do a risk evaluation of that single supplier or small group of suppliers. If these suppliers are working as a cooperative, for example, to artificially keep the prices high. Take, for example, the oil industry, and OPEC would be an example of that, where they, as a cooperative group, they keep keep oil prices at a particular level by controlling the supply to the market. So a second application of the model, the second way to a new firm can apply the 5 forces model to help determine whether it should enter an industry is by using the model to answer several key questions. So the questions are shown in the following slide as well. So here's a simple, flow chart of what you might want to consider, or should consider at least at the high level. So if we just briefly look at these here, is the industry a realistic place for a new venture? If yes, then go through the following questions. Are these areas in which we can avoid or diminish factors that suppress industry profitability? How can we get around it? Might be new technologies. Is there a unique position in the industry that avoids or diminishes the factors that suppress profitability? You might go in as a high-end luxury goods supplier into the fashion industry, for instance, or a manufacturer into the fashion industry, in a unique particular area, so that might still look attractive. And is there a superior business model that the industry incumbents would find hard to duplicate? So are there patents, are there copyright, and so on? Is there intellectual property, and are there manufacturing techniques and processes that competitors or the existing companies find it's difficult to copy? Or if you as an entrant want to use their technology, can you develop it cost effectively, and so on? And you answer these questions and you go around it. So you're constantly evaluating what's happening in each of the with respect to each of the elements of the model. So as we look down through then the industry types and opportunities they offer, so emerging industries in which standard operating procedures have yet to be developed. So opportunity in this case might be a first mover advantage. We would have seen a lot of that, for example, with manufacturing entities that move to 3D printing, for example, and 3D modeling. One of the latest ones I've seen today was a total newcomer to an industry. The name of the company, can't remember it now. I was only reading it this morning. Oh God. Well, anyway, essentially what they're proposing is a completely customizable 3D printed cycling shoe. So they take the measurements of each foot, obviously, and they create a simple model diagram through software, and they can actually print the complete shoe. Now, it's at the moment it's only in trial phase, but the interesting Lore, Lore is the name of the company. They've still some questions to answer, but their technique looks fascinating in terms of the technology and the way they're using 3D printed carbon as a complete shoe, not just the base and then so on, something on the uppers. They're doing the complete shoe, and that's extremely customizable. If they do manage to get their technologies together and make it mass producible, then they're onto a serious winner, because today to have such quality shoes made, you're looking at €3,500 to have individualized custom made shoes. And if they're coming into the market, let's just say in around €500-600, which would be marginally higher than the top end shoes today, yet they're all unique and customizable, then they're onto a serious first mover advantage. Most likely, as I said, they don't exist in the industry. They're totally new to the industry. You do have all the existing manufacturers and of cycling apparel and those into shoes and big names as such, but these could be a technology disruptor and taking a first mover advantage if they can get their processes finalized. And then we have fragmented industries that are characterized by a large number of firms of approximately equal size, so opportunity for consolidation. So again, you would have had that back in the earlier days, or midways through the telephone evolution, where you saw companies merging, Sony Ericsson, for example, consolidating to leverage off core competencies of each of the firms, and that kind of consolidation, where the industry was somewhat fragmented with so many different suppliers, only the fittest survived, and mostly through collaboration or as such. So mature industries that are experiencing slow or no increase in demand, so opportunities, so process innovation. So that's where you're in extremely mature industries. You would say that the car industry is mature. So how do they maintain or try to increase profitability? Through constant review of the process technology, innovation, new techniques, new processes, and that's where your pure project management skills come in. So every time a new technology or a new process is identified, it has to be rolled out in a methodical, structured fashion, hence project management. Let's try it out on one particular process and then roll it out across the organization. So all of these are happening, and that's why we marry the two of these, project management and business modeling and so on, enterprise. So often through process and after sales service, and this, for example, after sales are how the product was designed originally, such that you can easily replace parts, or make it easy to enable reverse logistics, have the product returned and repaired, replaced, whatever the case may be, and back out to the customer, all with a view to better customer satisfaction and retention. So then declining industries that are experiencing a reduction in demand, so opportunities, leadership, establishing a niche market, and pursuing a cost reduction strategy. So that's pretty much the follow-on from the mature. So in decline industry, it's not so much a race to the bottom, but constantly trying to sell the product off at a slightly lower than price than the newer products, but still giving value for money. In other words, bleeding their products or bleeding their assets. But usually companies that are moving into the decline phase already have their technology roadmaps to introduce new products, new services based on more current techniques, products, processes, technologies, and so on, to stay in business. That's the whole purpose. So they might phase out certain product lines. And then global industries. And finally on this would be industries that are experiencing significant international sales, so opportunity, multi-domestic and global strategies. And that's a pretty interesting one insofar as that it depends on the maturity of the particular market. So if we go back, for example, into the case of Dell, why did Dell move to Poland? Quite simply because Western Europe there was pretty much saturated with PC sales from various companies, and most everyone, let's just say, had PCs. So the market was going into the phenomenal growth of PC purchase had slowed down significantly, and Dell decided, well, let's move to Poland. Why? Not because of cheaper labor costs or anything like that at all. It was because they were closer to the Eastern European market, where broadband was only rolling out, are starting to roll out. Therefore, as broadband and the infrastructure started to roll out, more and more people were beginning to look at purchasing PCs and so on, and that's why they moved, and eventually they sold it on to a Taiwanese company. So the markets globally or internationally grow at different rates and at different paces and so on. So next, one of the biggest exploding markets now would be Central Africa. There's huge potential there for many companies and products to grow. And of course, you will find that products are being sold at much lower prices in those markets. The companies are still making profit, but they're making profit based on volumes. Why are they sold at lower prices? Simply because of the levels of income and so on in these jurisdictions and so on. So you can't be charging €1,000 for a phone in Central Africa, because no one is earning as much as that, generally speaking. So the competitor analysis within, so right in the core of the five forces, you have the competitor analysis. It's a detailed analysis of a firm's competition. So who are the players inside here? Who you're actually competing against? So you know your buyers, suppliers, and so on. Now you need to know who are the other players that are also I'm competing against. So it helps a firm understand the position of its major competitors and the opportunities that are available. So you might be looking at some of their techniques, their markets and so on. Say, well, you could probably perform better in that market than some of the existing players, companies, competitors. Or you might have a new technique or a new process technology that can produce your products more cost effectively than the incumbents. And that's what we're looking at in terms of the competitor analysis itself. So the competitive analysis grid is a tool for organizing information a firm collects about its competitors. So you're constantly scanning the competitor environment to see what they're doing, how they're doing it. Are there some things that you can learn from competitors that you can do more efficiently? And oftentimes that it can be your advantage because they can be the first movers, but you can come in an awful lot quicker because now the consumer base has been educated on the product or the service, and you can now come in. You don't have to spend as much on marketing, for example, trying to educate the consumers. So here we have the types of competitors for new ventures. You have the direct competitors, indirect competitors, and future competitors. So indirect, businesses offering close substitutes, and of course the direct ones exactly similar products and so on. And then future competitors, and these are the ones that you more importantly want to watch out for. You can manage existing and substitutes, but the futures, you need to be watching out what companies come. Like you take for example the one I just mentioned there, that Loar or Lorry, whatever way you want to pronounce it. They're coming out with a whole new technology and a production mechanism using 3D printing carbon shoes. Now they would be a future competitor, and the possibility there is if you were, for example, I don't know who's in the big into these Physic, Specialized, all these major bike companies. They might say, hang on a second, let's buy this Loar company because they would be a real threat to us in 2 years or 5 years time. Let's try and buy them now. And you can be quite sure that there are a couple of incumbents already looking at these companies and they're onto something. Or else, how can we match what they're doing? So looking at these future competitors, direct or indirect, could at any time. Now there could be some in a totally different industry, and you can say, what they're doing there could really benefit us. If we don't move, someone else will move, and so on. So collecting competitive intelligence. Now this is the fun part of it, I would say. So to complete a competitive analysis grid, a firm must first understand the strategies and behavior of its competitors. So the information that is gathered by the firm to learn about the competitors is referred to as competitive intelligence. So new venture should take care that it collects competitive intelligence in a professional and ethical manner. And that's why I smile at this. Is it always ethical? Is it always professional? No, of course not. Companies will buy products and reverse engineer them, take them apart, see how they work, see what they can do better, see can they replace components more cost effectively and produce a substitute good. One way of doing it. We do have industrial spies. It's reality. We call it competitive intelligence. It's just another way of getting someone to work in a company, see how they're producing, how what their patents are, and so on, and pass it back to a company, or sell secrets and sell trade secrets. Is it unethical? Absolutely. Does it go on? Absolutely. So it's and I say it's business. How you get it, as long as you can, how to say, don't get caught. I know that sounds horrendous, but that's the reality of it, and that's why you do have so many companies competing and fighting in courts, litigations over breach of patents and so on, because other companies have looked into, oh, we'll do that, and the company said, well, you're doing it exactly as we do. We have a patent on that, therefore you shouldn't be doing it, and so on, so on, so on. So, how would I respond in a situation like that? really only the lawyers are the winners in those type of situations. If a company breaches your patent, depending on the size and volume of it, more often it's more cost effective to move on and come out with the next iteration, the next generation or evolution of your product or service, whatever the case may be. And that's why I'm such a firm believer in the road mapping. So always trying to be one step ahead of your competitors, because they're going to find out. They're going to find out how you do what you do, and so on. And they're going to try and copy it or replicate it at least. Therefore, you want to be looking at ways to make it more difficult for them, and constantly, but at the same time, being conscious of what you're delivering to the customer to make it clear, easy, and simple to use, and so on. So the road mapping process is critical in terms of not wasting time trying to overly protect what you're already doing. Just keep on moving forward and moving forward and moving forward. So ethical ways to obtain information: attend conferences, trade shows, purchase competitors' products, study competitors' websites, and so on and so on. Talk to customers about what motivated them to buy, so you can get all this legitimate type of information about the product and find out why customers actually want to buy the product. And there's a lot of information available, and so on and so on. So that they're the ethical ways of doing it. But it's time consuming, costly, and you have to have the right people knowing how to do the right research to find out, to get answers to all those questions, or get more information, more insights. So many companies that attend trade shows do not only display their products, but they see, but to see what their competitors are up to. So it's a great information gathering forum, so to speak. So this is a photograph of a 21 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, and these go on. You have them. CeBIT would be one of the biggest computing and technology conference, and they have them in Europe, usually in Germany, once a year. But they're phenomenal. They're just huge in terms of the products that are being. You have them dotted across the globe, the various trade shows as such, and you get to see all potentially future technologies coming down the road and all that sort of stuff, and it's a great eye-opener. And oftentimes some great deals are done in these, because you'll find that some company that you might never have heard of are producing a technology which complements your product or service tremendously well, and you can negotiate, and there's a hell of a lot of deals done in these types of situations, partnerships and so on. So a competitive analysis grid, such a tool for organizing the information a firm collects about its competitors. So all the information you need about the competitor, and here is an example of such a grid. And essentially, folks, that's the last slide on that. And it was a bit of a lengthy one, which is why we couldn't get it all covered last Thursday. And so you can view that for yourselves on that. That's it in terms of competitive analysis. But the key points to take from that, you're collecting data, you're looking at opportunities, and then you have to turn these opportunities into actions. And the actionable process is through a project methodology or something similar, but essentially, let's gather the data, the facts, the details, the information. Now, can we do something with this? And then build a set of requirements, build a set of objectives, and from there then next put the resources in place to deliver on those objectives. And hence we end up coming up with a new product or a new feature or a suite of features and so on. So it's all done in a precise, methodical manner. So you have all the groundwork done, such as these analyses, and then put a cost onto it, which is the business case itself. This is what's justifiably spending money on this particular project, and what we could potentially see in terms of returns and profitability, and so on, so on, so on. Okay, folks, that's essentially it on the competitive analysis. And yeah, now that we're here back into the starting page, I'll piece both of these sections together and upload them, as I promised I would do, back up onto Moodle, and then we'll see you for the next lecture. Okay, folks, take it easy. Cheerio. Bye-bye.